I'd like to share the cumulative forage reduction index approach that we have developed in working with ranchers and advisory agency folk, primarily in Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado. And in order to do that, we need to start off by taking a quick look at what we consider to be the expected benefits of this cumulative forage reduction index. Before I begin, I'd like to emphasize the fact that you did have a file with 7 handouts, and I hope that you've had an opportunity to print those off. The first 4 handouts would be completed sheets, and the last 3 are blank worksheets which you can use for your location. Page 1 is one I'd like you to focus on as we begin in your handouts, which is titled Worksheet, and it is for the Cumulative Forage Reduction Index, or the CFR Index. The expected benefits of this index would include 2, I think, valuable points, and the first is that we tried to design it in a way that would help ranchers avoid drought-induced declines in livestock market value. And so this is a timing issue, and we'll cover those points as we go through the program. The second thing I'd like to emphasize in terms of expected benefits would be that we want to optimize the resilience of rangeland vegetation during and after the drought experience. There are a number of ways for us to look at optimizing rangeland resilience. I think there are 2 primary ways that we can do that, and the CFR index will help us do so. The first is to avoid the combination of overgrazing and drought stress. It's the combination of those 2 stresses that reduce the vigor and the relative composition of desirable or preferred plant species. And the second issue is a hydrological issue, and that is that we need to maintain adequate plant cover. There are a number of site-specific pieces of information that every individual will need to have, and they are listed on this slide. We'll start off with monthly precipitation, and you need to acquire this information from locations as close to home as possible. The first one will be the long-term monthly average precipitation values. In the CFR worksheet, which is page 1 of the handouts, I'd like you to look at column number 1. And in column number 1, what you see is cumulative monthly precipitation values. These are long-term values. You need to have at least 20 years or more. And I would encourage you to get at least the most recent past 20 years of data nearest your location. I need to emphasize that the CFR table is broken into 3 categories. It has cumulative precipitation, herbage-production, and forage reduction. And we're going to focus initially on cumulative precipitation with these first 2 site variables. You can see that in column 2 on the CFR worksheet that now we're looking at current year values. And in column 2, 3.18 was the total for this location in 2012 for all of the time from October 1 through the end of March. And then at the end of April in 2012, we had a grand total of 0.98 inches that was added to the preceding total, taking the next cumulative value to 4.16, just to emphasize that process. The next kind of site-specific information that you're going to need is the monthly percentages of herbage production. And you could use the web soil survey site to acquire these values, but I would encourage you to begin first by working with your local NRCS range management specialist so that you can get the values that are needed to complete column number 5 on the CFR worksheet. And those numbers are nothing more than the percent of the total annual herbage production expected in each month from the beginning to the end of the growing season. Contact your local NRCS folk to acquire this information. Then we would draw your attention to the need for monthly percentages of total summer livestock forage use, and that's for the current year. Now, the second page of your handouts is titled Summer Cow Unit Forage Use Worksheet. And this is a very simple way to estimate the percentage of herd forage consumption that will occur in each month. If you go to the bottom half of that worksheet and go to the far right-hand corner, then you will see the percentages there on that second page that also occur, also occur in column 10 of the CFR worksheet. We need to talk about three important assumptions. If you're going to evaluate this method for your location, you need to understand that we have three assumptions that are involved in the development of the CFR index methodology. And that is, the first is that the expected herbage production is directly related to precipitation. So that when we have dry conditions, we obviously have a direct and a one-to-one decline in herbage production. But the next assumption is also very important, and that is that all expected drought-induced herbage deficits are billed directly to the livestock enterprise from the beginning of the plant precipitation year. Let me draw your attention to the CFR worksheet and point out that the plant precipitation year in our work area, that's Nebraska, northeast Colorado, and eastern Wyoming, for us, that begins after killing frost the preceding year in October, and then dormant season ends the end of March, and we begin to get green up in April in our region. The issue here is that every deficit that occurs compared to the long-term average is charged against the cattle, against the moderate stocking rate that we have, that we are using. It's important for me to explain what we mean by herbage as well as forage. Herbage is the middle category of numerical information on our CFR worksheet, and we define that as all non-woody above-ground plant growth. We define forage as the percentage of average year grass and sedge herbage that is allocated for livestock consumption. Notice that I'm emphasizing grass and sedge. The CFR index is set up to work with cattle enterprises, and we'll take a look at how we account for these values in our definition of moderate stocking. Now, it's a long-standing practice of the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, to recommend initial stocking rates for rangeland. And typically, you can see by looking at information that they are very closely estimated if you just simply base your stocking rates on 25% use of the average year total peak standing herbage from all species. And if you have that number, then you can estimate your stocking rate in terms of animal unit months. You would have 1,000 pound beef month or an animal unit month of grazing, worth of grazing, for every 780 pounds within that 25% of peak standing herbage. Now, on average, cattle would consume about 32% of all grass and sedge. Initially, we start off looking at all species, but we know that cattle preferentially graze grasses and sedges. So this number of 32% is a critical value in the CFR index, and I want to draw your attention to column number 8. Column number 8 under the bold font heading of drought induced. is going to be a drought-induced forage reduction, and you will see that in parentheses, the mathematical process is to take the numerical value in column 7 and multiply it times 3.125. That's just simply the inverse of 1 over 0.32. Again, 0.32 as in 32%. The third assumption that we make with the CFR index is that total estimates of livestock forage use are based on moderate stocking rates. And those stocking rates are based on calculations derived from average or near average year precipitation years. Stocking rates can vary from year to year all over the place over a 10-year time period. But the stocking rates that are used in the CFR index are based on average year carrying capacity. And again, you can work with your NRCS range management specialist on that aspect. Let's talk about the destocking process and how to use the CFR index values, the table, as well as some of the other sheets that are in your handout. The beginning point in any year, regardless of whether we know that it's a drought or not, is to start with realistic livestock numbers, and that's on a total weight basis. Well, there are a number of guidelines that we can use. We could take a look, for example, and especially so in a drought year, if we take a look at the pastures now spring of this year, we can take, we need to drive through or ride through all of our pastures and take a look at the residual herbage that is out on that land. We need also to take a look at our plant year precipitation. And in this example, the CFR worksheet example, you can see that in column 2 for the year of 2012 started off below the long-term average dormant season precipitation. If you look at the CFR table, you'll see in column 1 the long-term average of 3.78 inches. In 2012, we were about 0.6 below that. We had 3.18 inches, and that was a 16% deficit at that point. That was not a huge concern until we got into the subsequent months. The other issue is to take a look at cumulative precipitation deficits during rapid growth windows. And I would draw your attention to column number 4 in the CFR worksheet and look for numerical values in column number 4 that are 30% or higher. And those are levels of precipitation deficits that will cause induced tiller mortality and reduce herbage production potential. Now, in addition to looking at your past records and current records, there's also a world of help available through the forecasts, and we had an opportunity to listen to Mark Svoboda already, and he talked about the different forecasts, and this slide and the next slide on forecast are easily accessible. All you need to do is go to the Drought Monitor website. In fact, if you want to just type this in on a search engine, all you have to do is type the 2 words Drought Monitor, and at that point in time you can go to the top toolbar and select forecast, and you can follow these guidelines as you go through. This trail, this website trail, will take you very quickly to the Climate Prediction Center that is provided and routinely updated by NOAA. Once you get to this page, you can place your cursor over each of the map titles that are at the bottom of each blue banner, and you can take a look at a lot of information for different time intervals, 1 week, 2 week, 1 month, 3 month time intervals. Now, the shorter the time interval, the higher the skill level or the higher level of reliability. But one thing I want to caution everybody on is that when you see EC or equal chance on a precipitation map, that is not a forecast of average precipitation. In fact, what we have observed over the last couple of years is that if your location is in an area mapped EC, and you then check the forecasted air temperatures and they are above average, that's a fairly good indication that you are going to have a dry to drought year. Well, let me move beyond the next slide because you can take a look at this as time allows. And I want to go to the next issue here on destocking using the CFR table, which is page 1 of your handout. Remember we strongly encourage you to begin with realistic numbers. The second phase of destocking is that point in time when we start to look at cumulative drought-induced forage deficits. And when we take a look at those drought-induced forage deficits, those will show up in column 8, drought-induced forage deficits. And let me emphasize again that the calculations you need to do in order to complete the CFR table are in parentheses above each column. Each column has a set of mathematical instructions that is above, in parentheses, it would be above each column. Now, so we're looking at a situation now where when these expected drought-induced forage deficits are likely to exceed 20%, it's at that point in time that we want to remove predetermined subsets of livestock quickly. Now, you heard from previous speakers, from Lynn Myers and from Ted Alexander and others, that it's terribly important to separate your livestock into different subsets so that you know that when you're going to run short on forage, those can be moved very quickly. And we're not saying that they have to be sold. We're telling you that if you use the CFR index, that the advance warning that you'll get with this approach will allow you to sell those cattle if you decide to do so at a better market price than you would 2, 3, and 4 weeks down the road. We'd emphasize that these subsets of livestock that you remove in total, they're the non-used forage that you would have as a result of not carrying that particular subset forward needs to be as equal to or greater than the expected forage deficit. The third phase of destocking, literally from the month of June onward, focuses on the CFR index itself, which is the far right-hand column. If you take a look at the CFR worksheet, go all the way to the right-hand column, you can see that those numbers are in bold font, and they start off with a 0, then a 4, and then you can see a very rapid rate of increase in those CFR index values. And that's not surprising. In this particular example, in the western panhandle of Nebraska in 2012, we only got about half of the plant year precipitation compared to the long-term average. But the point is, when they're likely to exceed 100, well, let's take a look at the CFR index, and we can see that the index, the CFR index itself, goes from 38 all the way to 102 by the end of June. And there would be some forecast, some warning there when you take a look at the drought-induced deficits, forage deficits. The cumulative drought-induced forage deficits in column 9 are good indicators of what is about to happen. And remember that by the time we get to the end of May in this example, we have an estimated 32% loss or drought-induced reduction of forage, which means we should be removing one or more subsets of livestock at that time in order to avoid the combination of drought stress and overgrazing. Destocking also is important from the standpoint that relatively abundant residual herbage from past years can offset end-of-season CFR index values by 10 to 30 percentage points. And the drought that we experienced in our region in 2012 could very well have begun with above average levels of residual herbage in the spring of 2012. The growing conditions for 2010 and 11 were generally above average in much of Nebraska, not so much down in the east central part of Colorado. But when you have a tremendous amount of residual herbage from preceding years, that can buffer your index, but only to the tune of about 10 to 30 percentage points. Now, would like to finish up the discussion today by just pointing out that the CFR index is designed and used in the semi-arid region. And to give you a better understanding, that means we're working with ranchers that have long-term average precipitation of somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to up to 22 inches of precipitation a year. And within this region, we focus on three guidelines in terms of how well we're doing with grazing management in a drought year. Let's take a look at these individually, but they're listed here: residual plant cover, recovery of preferred species, and range condition. What do we mean by these three different phrases? Well, very quickly, when we think about minimum residual cover, that's a level, that's an end-of-season herbage that we see after moderate summer grazing in years with near average precipitation. I want to emphasize that again: after moderate summer grazing in years with near average precipitation. And so making a comparison, a relative comparison among neighbors is not the standard. You may have a little more than the neighbors, but if you really want to have minimum residual cover, you need to have some photographs and mental images of what your pastures actually look like in preceding years when you had near average levels of precipitation. Full plant recovery, that is the highest level of plant recovery that we see in our work area, occurs after uninterrupted growth with average or better precipitation once in every 3 years or less. It's under these conditions where we see the very highest level of vigor and productivity of our preferred plant species. Those are preferred midgrasses and tall grasses. And then finally, when we talk about range condition in our work area, in Nebraska, eastern Colorado, and eastern Wyoming, we're focusing primarily on the vigor and the relative abundance of our preferred midgrasses and tall grasses. And once you know those species, then every time you travel through the pasture, you're looking for those species, and you need to make notes about what's happening to their relative abundance and vigor. And the reason is because herbage production potential, the ability of your rangeland to produce herbage, is very much related to vegetation resilience and range condition. Remember that the ability of your land to produce the forage that you need for your livestock is profoundly affected by vegetation resilience and range condition. Thank you.